Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this CSIS webinar hosted here by the Project on Nuclear Issues. My name is Rebecca Hersman, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. Good morning to everyone in the United States, and a special good afternoon to our colleagues from the United Kingdom who are joining us today. Our conversation today is on the UK Integrated Review, Strategic Challenges and Opportunities for Defense and Diplomacy. Before we dive into the substance, let me just highlight a couple of reminders for those of you who are joining us online. The entire conversation is on the record. A recording of the event will be available on the event page in the coming days. Viewers should use the gallery view in Zoom to get the best view of the participants. We'll be doing a moderated Q&A. I will be asking our guests several questions to get the conversation started. And then about halfway through, we will hand the baton over to you and the audience to ask your questions. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function of the webinar, and I will do my best to kind of keep track and sort and bring as many of the issues into play as we can. So with that, let's get started. On March 16th, the UK government released its Security and Defence Blueprint for the coming decade. Global Britain in a Competitive Age, the Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development, and Foreign Policy. The review covers a lot of ground, from force structure to development and diplomacy. And the review has made some news and some headlines here in our nuclear community by establishing some new posture and policy requirements for the UK nuclear deterrent. We're definitely going to get to that. But some of the most significant shifts in policy and priority, both in terms of defense and diplomacy, seem to focus on technology and strategic complexity. In this regard, the review seems to stake out some new ground on issues related to multi-domain conflict, emerging technology investment and leadership, the challenges of dealing with risks below the level of armed conflict, such as disinformation, but also the complex set of risks that fall along the conventional and strategic interface that challenge traditional strategic notions of deterrence and arms control. You know, there's a paragraph in the review that I think hits on a lot of these questions that we'll be talking about. It says, competition will continue within the conventional military domains of land, sea, and air, and will grow in other spheres, including technology, cyberspace, and space, further shaping the wider geopolitical environment. And systemic competition will further test the lines between peace and war as malign actors use a wider range of tools, such as economic statecraft, cyber attacks, disinformation, proxies, and so forth, to achieve their objectives. So that is, I think, a tremendous area of discussion. There's lots of threads to pull on, new areas for diplomacy, regulatory, cyberspace, new priorities for trade-offs for defense, new challenges for leading NATO and other partners to kind of adapt to this vision and embrace these challenges. And we have two wonderful guests joining us today to discuss this, perfectly placed. We have Angus Lapsley, who is the Director General for Strategy and International Affairs at the UK Ministry of Defence. In this role, Angus is responsible for defense policy on NATO and the Euro-Atlantic, defense implications of exiting EU, and our key bilateral defense relationships, as well as strategic planning and strategic policy matters. He's had a long and august career serving in the UK civil service in a range of posts, and we really welcome Angus here to discuss this with us today. But we also have another stalwart of UK foreign policy, Samantha Job, who is Director for Defense and International Security at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Samantha is responsible for leading the Foreign Commonwealth's office work in a broad range of areas, including NATO, European defense and security, global security and partnerships, counterproliferation, arms control, arms exports, as well as helping to deliver the vision set out in the recent UK integrated review across that diplomatic landscape. So she actually has quite a few new items in her job jar, it seems, coming out of the review, and we really look forward to hearing about that from an implementation perspective. Again, a tremendous career, and we feel really honored to have both of you here to talk about this with us today. So, with that, what I'd like to do is just kind of dive into a couple of key questions and kind of open the floor to just a discussion between us all, and then we'll involve the audience. So, welcome to you both. Thrilled to have you here. And I think a good place to start is in part on this issue of technology. The strategic review stresses a need to lead and invest in technology-driven change, in part because of a security environment that's characterized by a range of technology-driven challenges: space, cyber, artificial intelligence, advanced sensing, not to mention a rapidly developing landscape in terms of advanced air defenses, missile defenses, long-range dual-capable strike, like hypersonic capabilities. And these types of investments inevitably require risk-taking in other areas. So clearly the review had to make some tough trade-offs, I would say, in terms of setting priorities and identifying areas to take risk. Angus, maybe I could turn to you first to kind of tackle some of that question.
Well, thanks, Rebecca, and hello, everyone, and morning to everyone in the US. And it's great to be amongst you. And it's also really good to be on a platform with Samantha again. She and I made the case for a lot of what's in the review internally within government, so it's only fair that we now get sent out to explain it externally. Look, so Rebecca, as you highlighted when you were introducing, I think the kind of underlying premise of this integrated review and the defence white paper that followed it is that we are in a more competitive world, and that's going to be the dominant feature of the next decade or so. And it's, the essence of this is that most of the problems we have been dealing with from a security perspective over the last 10, 15, 20 years, many of which have been the problems of weak states like terrorism, for example, they haven't gone away. And if anything, many of them have got more complex. But we now face a growing range of threats from other states who seek to change the world around us and have quite well worked through and ambitious agendas for doing so. And we've been, in a sense, dealing with the Russia piece of that for the last 15 years or so. It's become progressively clear that Russia was not heading in a direction that we wanted, and it's becoming progressively clear, even for those of us here in Europe, that we have to also deal with the challenge that China is now posing to those bits of the global order that we value. So that is the kind of underlying context, and I think the central message of the integrated review is that Britain is a country that wants to step up to those challenges. We regard ourselves as a burden-sharing nation, willing to make investment and, as you say, some quite difficult choices about what to invest in order to do our part to maintain global stability, including making substantial investments in increasing defence spending. As you say, technology has been kind of quite a strong part of that story. And I think, and I'll answer this from a defence perspective, and I think Samantha will want to sort of broaden things. I think we see technology, first of all, as a really important part of the way conventional warfare is changing. And, the emphasis we place on technology does not mean the UK is moving away from caring about conventional warfare. In fact, if you look at the structure of our defence budget, the vast majority of it will continue to go into modernising our forces for what might be recognisably conventional warfare. But technology is a really important part of how that conventional warfare is changing. And you mentioned technologies like hypersonics, directed energy weapons would be another. The application of artificial intelligence to conventional warfare weaponry. I mean, there's a whole range of potential pivot points in military technology being driven through at the moment. And it's important that the UK invests in our own capabilities and does so with allies and partners. Above all else, the United States, but also European partners as well. But secondly, new technologies are being used in ways that are not so conventional. They're being used as part of a more persistent competition with the West, designed to, I think, sort of undermine our coherence, undermine our confidence, undermine, in some cases, even our belief in the systems that sustain us, in democracy at its heart. And that's partly to do with the development of cyber technology, but it's not just that. It's also to do with the ability, for example, to interfere with what happens in space, which is becoming an increasingly worrying issue. And then I think, thirdly, technology, to some extent, can help us square some of the circles. So as you say, if you're going to invest in tech, that means you've got arguably less money to spend on people or conventional military equipment. And that's the kind of trade-off we have to deal with in defense ministries. But it can also enable you to get far more out of people and conventional equipment. You look at a modern fighter jet, it looks pretty similar to a fighter jet of the 1970s from the outside. But the development of what we would call tech actually means that a modern fighter jet is immeasurably more capable than a fighter jet in the 1970s. Its sensors, its ability to target its weapons, they are incomparably better. And that tech race actually, in some ways, is allowing us to get much more out of the conventional force we have. It is not a panacea, though. And some of the media reporting suggested that the UK was kind of, placing all our chips on the tech table. We're not. We know that we have to considerably improve the digital backbone of our defence forces so that they can communicate properly, so that they can make the most out of the enormous amounts of data that can now be collected. But we also know, no armed forces are worth much unless you invest in people, and unless the basic metal platforms that people move around in and use are also up to scratch. So yes, tech is a really important part of our vision, but we should keep it in perspective. It's part of the vision. It's not the whole story.
Great, thank you. Samantha, it does sort of, the diplomatic environment is changing and is becoming also increasingly technology driven. The review really stresses an integrated approach to this emphasis on technology and the need for sort of defense and diplomacy to move in lockstep. How do you see this working together, and how do you see it changing, business that from the past? How's the future different because of technology and technology diplomacy than it might have been in the past?
So one of the things which was striking to readers who perhaps hadn't spent as long as we had thinking about it might be that they read the integrated review and see that the first chapter is about science and technology. Now, that flows from a very clear sense that this is one of the things which is changing very quickly around us, and the world and the environment in which we operate is going to touch every aspect of our lives as it has in the past, but in a very much more part of our kind of defense and diplomacy lives could change significantly in this time, in some ways, in ways that we don't fully understand yet, because those technologies are still evolving. But what we need to think about is how those are going to be part of the international conversation, and they already are. So cyber is something which there will be colleagues on this call more expert than I am, but if you think where the conversation is about kind of cyber standards and international engagement, cyber is an integral part of foreign policy and defence policy. That simply wasn't the case, obviously, 20 or 30 years ago. And as Angus has already alluded to, space is coming up fast behind as something which we are conscious that all of our lives, and I'm not talking about defence and diplomacy lives, just our lives are dependent on. And it's time to really think through what does that therefore mean for the strategic assets we need to be aware of and look after, and also nefarious behaviour of others. How do we prepare for that, protect against it, and lead work which the UK has led internationally on what sort of norms of behaviour might look like. How do we start the diplomatic conversation about what's acceptable or not acceptable in space behaviour? And that's a conversation which we've kicked off through the UN, but which is still live and will continue from some time. And that is, if you like, classic diplomacy, because we're talking to all of the people that I have strategic diplomacy, strategic policy dialogues with. Space is now on the agenda, and it would not have been 2 or 3 years ago in the way that it is now, because everyone is recognizing that this is an area that we need to move forward. And there will be other ways that comes true. There is already, as you will be aware, a sort of arms control conversation that talks about, well, which of these new technologies do we need to control? In some cases, almost before we know what they are. But that shows a sort of sense of concern and a sense of needing to do analytical work, science and technology work, have the scientists with us in the room, have the conversation with the experts about what it means and what it doesn't mean to inform that international conversation. And also to identify those opportunities. So if you are, again, looking at arms control and verification, as we do in the UK and as you do in the US, what opportunities does it offer you? Might you have opportunities to do arms control verification through technology that gives you an opportunity to do the sorts of monitoring that have not been possible in the past? That's going to be something that we want to talk about too. So in each of these cases, there are sort of risks to manage and opportunities to think about. And either way, there's nearly always a diplomacy angle on the end of how do we have the conversation internationally to frame those. You've highlighted one other thing in that question, which I think is a thread that we could either pull out a bit more, but I'll just set out a little bit now. And that is that this document was quite consciously not a defence review or a national security strategy. It is an integrated review for a reason. And that is a very strong sense that in order to respond to the complexity of the world that we find ourselves in nationally and internationally, we need to have a sense of all the different levers of government and frankly of society to be engaged in that conversation and to be ready and prepared to respond to it. And in some ways that is, in my organisation, has been embodied by the bringing of development and diplomacy together. It's also in the defence strategy, and Angus can speak to this further, more of a kind of persistent engagement posture for defence to be part of, be out in the world, engaging with impact and diplomacy overseas as well. So all of the different levers, and I could say the same thing about the relationship between domestic departments and how we have to operate at home to be ready abroad, and how we have to have those two things linked. So there's a lot more complexity in how we need to think as governments across the full range of activity to engage internationally, to be operating in the world that we operate in. And that, I think, is going to be a big feature for all of us as we make this real and as we engage to have the kind of effects that we want to have in the world.
Yes, I think that's those are great points, several threads to pull on. But I think one in particular that sort of relates to both of you is when we're thinking about these ranges of technologies, whether it's space, cyber, artificial intelligence, or several others that were raised. Biotechnology is a great example, right? Sources of great good, potential sources of great risk, perceived differently in this highly competitive environment, right? So you can't really bring a disarmament mindset to it, because clearly no one's going to disarm themselves of biotechnology or space or cyber, or even a lot of the capabilities, military capabilities that may be resting on those. And yet certainly some ways to find ways to introduce some measure of control, some rules of the road, some ways to regulate that is critical. How do we do that? How are you thinking about that? Because we have to sort of preserve our advantages to some extent, right? While opening the door to thinking about how to allow controls to sort of make us safer, so that we don't just race through these new domains. I think that's probably for both of you in terms of how do you stem the arms racing kind of side of this at the same time you open the diplomatic door, while recognizing you need to capture the opportunities these technologies provide.
So I'll go first on that one and then let Angus expand. I mean, the first thing to say is to make sure we're all talking to each other and understand each other's equities. And that's within any national community. So what are our scientists engaged in, and where do they want to go with their technology? Where does defence want to go with it? Where does domestic capabilities, resilience sort of angles to it? What are we going to use the technology for? We need to understand that. Governments need to understand where industry and science are, because they're frequently way ahead of old-fashioned diplomats like me. And then we need to understand that the world that they're operating in and the world that we are operating in need to interact. So that's the first thing I would say. And you need sort of science literate diplomats, and you need science literate policy thinkers. And the second thing that you need is for other countries to be in a similar position. So there's a kind of an international conversation about, do we all understand those things, so that you can have an equivalent conversation with partners internationally. And the third thing you can do is you're right that it's not a disarmament mindset, but some of the thinking where you might call it a stability mindset or a strategic stability mindset might be appropriate. So that you might say there will under all circumstances be things that are beyond the pale. There are in all circumstances the things that one should not do with any of these capabilities, and start thinking about those, or start from that end. You might start with transparency. It's an old-fashioned sort of theme, but it's a really good one to say to people, well, what have you got? And report it and tell us, and let's have a conversation about it. Where are the parameters of that for national security and international security? So I think some of the thinking approaches can be similar, but we need to really, really understand how the old and the new match. And maybe in this conversation, we'll get onto deterrence, for instance, which is a classic area where, how do you do your sub-threshold deterrence? How do you stop somebody doing these sub-threshold things, which they're probably only doing because they don't want to do the conventional and they really don't want to do the nuclear. And you don't want to drive them into either of those fields either. But you need to think about how you do the same kind of conversations internationally to say, well, if you do that, there'll be a consequence. So do you want to do that? And yet do that in a non-escalatory way. So there's a whole other thread on how you kind of do the deterrence part of this. And the reason I use that as an example is because it's some of the same mindsets, but it needs updating with the expertise, with the scientists, with the technology, and with academia, with industry, so that we're bringing all that conversation together. Otherwise, we'll have a diplomatic conversation and it just doesn't feel real.
Yeah, great points. Angus.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with all of that. And as you can imagine, I think in probably most capitals, there's sometimes a kind of to and fro discussion between defence and foreign ministries about which end of the telescope do you start from? Do you start from what do we want in terms of defence capabilities versus kind of what do the global norms look like? But I think it's as Samantha says, in the UK, it's a pretty good and open, transparent toing and froing. So if you take it, for example, space. I think it's there is one camp of countries out there that frankly doesn't want any rules in space at all, doesn't really want any norms in space, just wants to be able to do what they want to do, and that's quite clearly not in our interests as a country. It's in our interests, as for the reason Samantha set out, to have some rules of the road in space, to have some norms that countries respect. Equally, there's sometimes there's a school of thought that says, well, we shouldn't have any military capabilities in space at all, but that's simply not realistic either. And it's about finding a responsible middle way between them. And I think we would start in an area like space with actually understanding what's going on is really hard, both in terms of what's going on structurally, who's doing what kind of things, but also just awareness of what's happening on any given day and any given moment in space, who is maneuvering to do what. And I think we, like a number of sort of medium-sized powers at the moment, are investing in improving our ability to understand what's happening in space, and to control national UK assets in a meaningful way. I think secondly, we would place a lot of emphasis on allies and partnership. Space is a good example of an area where the United States provides tremendous leadership and support to all of its allies in space. None of us could operate in space without the support the US provides. But as allies, we need to be thinking about what more we can bring to the party and how we can help strengthen resilience. And I think resilience is really important because it may well be that there are countries out there with scary capabilities that can do scary things to you in space. And as Samantha says, you might be able to deter that in some cases, not necessarily deter it symmetrically. So it may not be a like for like capability that deters the other side from using it. But you might also be able to blunt its impact by building resilience into your systems. So maybe they can shoot a satellite down, but actually if there are plenty of other satellites that can all then fill in the gaps, it doesn't matter as much. So I think resilience becomes a really important part of this. I think the other thing you can do, as well as kind of building norms of behavior, is you can call out misbehavior. And this is, I think it's still a bit of a work in progress, but certainly countries like the US and the UK, Australia, Canada we started to become, I think, a bit more assertive about calling out misbehavior when we see it, in particular in space. And I think that's part of moving this debate along. So, I mean, as a defense official, obviously, I'm sort of super realistic about, if we need capability, we need capability. But it doesn't exist in a vacuum, even, well, maybe the stuff in space does, but you know what I mean? It doesn't exist in a policy vacuum.
Of course, indeed. Well, you kind of teed up my next question, which is, the review doesn't sort of stop at sort of thinking in kind of national terms in terms of developing your policy. Really stresses the importance of taking this to kind of a multilateral dialogue, and the importance of working through collective action and the primacy of NATO as a source of collective security and action. So I'm just really wondering, though, that these are some challenging issues. I don't know that allies are ready to move in lockstep on some of these priorities. So clearly a lot of work to be done there. How are you building kind of collective support behind some of these ideas? How are you plan to sort of get allies on board, both with the investments and the risks and changes that might be involved with these sort of shifting priorities? Just even also from the exercise perspective, getting them to prioritize there. Whichever one of you wants to jump in first on that.
Shall I go first on that one? So I think the first thing to say is, I've hesitated before saying this sort of publicly before, but I think NATO played a bigger role in our decision-making process about what we invested in and why than it's done probably in any UK strategic review for 20 years. And I think that speaks to the nature of the threat we see, and our realization that NATO is what makes us stronger. It's that alliance that makes the UK feel relatively secure about its place in the world. So it certainly speaks to the threat. So the first thing we did was made sure we were, getting our investments right to meet our core objectives in NATO. But this discussion about modernization of defense, modernization of how we do diplomacy in a more competitive age, it's not just a discussion happening in the UK. I mean, each country has its own vernacular for the discussion, but it's happening all over Europe as well, in slightly different ways. And actually, lots of the themes that we are talking about today are themes in NATO as well. Certainly, the question of how does new technology disrupt the way we do defense and deterrence? How does the rise of China as a global military player affect the way NATO thinks about its security? How do we deal with an increasingly aggressive Russia, which is it's on our minds even today? We have a special meeting of the North Atlantic Council tomorrow with ministers to talk about the situation in Ukraine. So I think there's probably rather more in our integrated review and in our defence white paper that reflects the nature of debate in NATO at the moment than you might think. Certainly, as a leading member in NATO, we also like to try and push that debate forward in NATO itself. And Samantha may want to talk about the Reflections Group, which was a really excellent example of that debate moving forward, I think. So I think it's not either NATO or this agenda. I think the two things come together.
How about you, Samantha?
So I would agree with that. And Angus and I have both had conversations with a lot of international partners about the integrated review, both before and since it was published, but certainly in the since it was published category, I've spoken to colleagues all around the world, not one of whom has challenged the strategic picture which the integrated review sets out. They have all said, we recognize this world that you are painting. We recognize the issues which you say are out there for us to consider, both in the immediate present, what it looks like now, and that forward view out to 2030. And they have all recognized the way, I mean, the conversation we've just had about technology, but the way that the nature of conflict may change. If there were a conflict tomorrow, they know that the first things that an adversary might do is attack their communications with a cyber capability and possibly a space capability as well. You know, that part of the journey we are all on together. How we prepare for it and what we do about it and what it means in defence capability terms or you know, international organisational responses is the phase that we're in, if you like. And it's not going to happen overnight, because every country goes around this journey looking at their own particular part of the world and what that means for their national consequences as well. But I have talked to people in all different parts of the world, and they've all said, yes, we see what you're getting at. And they have all said, this is an important conversation to be having. And they have all said, this is a journey we need to go on, but that we all need to have this level of understanding of how to prepare for it without losing the things that we need for yesterday's threats, which, as Angus has described, haven't gone away. So everybody understands the challenge, and I think that is the first step towards having the conversations that we need to. Since Angus gave me the plug for it, so it is worth really looking at the Reflections Group report from NATO, which sets out exactly these challenges about emerging technology, about, you know, in my world, looking at the political tools that NATO has to be doing you know, proactive communications as part of its defensive alliance nature. I mean, that's a critical part of what we look at now. If we look at the role of disinformation to, you know, at its most extreme, it's out there to undermine democratic consent for defence activities. You know, that's not something that we can sit back and let happen. So there's a real agenda here, not just on the scientific side, but on the sort of political tools side, to tackle what this world looks like and not have it happen at us or around us, but have us be an active partners together in that debate internationally. So we don't wake up one day and discover that actually all the people that we wanted to work with have had various things happen to them that mean they're not, you know, that we can't act. So it is absolutely critical to go on this journey with everyone together, and that's precisely where the Reflections Group came out. It's also where the 2030 agenda is going. Those conversations will continue, but I think you've put your finger on the right question, but we haven't fully answered it yet, but we're on it.
Very good. Well, what I will do is I have a few more minutes of my chance to talk with you before I open it up. The questions are starting to come in, so I know I'm going to want to give time to everyone in the audience, but I would like to turn to some of the nuclear issues that were raised in the review and that have actually gotten a fair bit of attention. I mean, we wouldn't be the project on nuclear issues if we didn't go there, right? So, you know, the three main areas, it seems, that the review sort of touches on and appears to shift policy a bit. First, having to do with the cap on your nuclear stockpile and raising the overall cap from 225 to 260 warheads, as well as adjusting what goals or commitments to downward ceilings were in the past. That has gotten a fair bit of attention, especially in terms of trying a little bit of grasping in terms of the why. And what sort of signal it sends. So on the why, on sort of the defense side, what's driving that change in requirement? And then on the diplomatic side, you know, a bit of ouch on the timing and trying to understand how does this play out in terms of the broader diplomatic environment. But then there's a couple of other things that seem to go along with that have gotten some attention. So I'll just flag those. The other is sort of transparency declarations, reducing the amount of information that might be made available in terms of declaring the size of the operational warhead or the numbers of warheads and operational missiles that are deployed. You know, and Samantha, you had mentioned the importance of transparency. So this too has garnered some attention. And I think the final area, again, not unrelated to the prior conversation, has to do with a kind of a pretty deliberate sense to broaden the aperture of declaratory policy. And to introduce a bit more ambiguity about what types of threats might warrant, in extremis, of course, some potential nuclear response. So taken together, those seem to be some pretty significant changes in terms of UK nuclear policy. So I guess, Angus, I would turn to you first. I mean, like, have I accurately described those changes? Would you correct anything I've said? And how might you sort of explain the how and why of that, the actual implications? And then I think, as we mentioned before we started, Samantha, in many ways, this baton now hands to you of explaining this to partners around the world, making sure the deterrence message is present, but also that the diplomacy, disarmament, and arms control messages are there as well, especially as you go into the NPT review conference. So Angus, why don't I turn to you first to kind of tackle some of this?
Sure. Well, look, in some ways, Rebecca, I think the message we're sending is a pretty simple one. It's that the UK continues to have the minimum deterrent, but we are also determined that it should remain a credible deterrent. And the decisions that we took in this review that represented a change from previously stated policy were about maintaining the credibility of our deterrent. But it's really, really important to note all the things that didn't change and actually haven't changed in UK policy now for over 20 years. Our policy is to have a minimum credible deterrent, which is committed to NATO, and it's actually uniquely committed to NATO. We regard nuclear weapons and the deterrent as something which would only be used in the most extreme circumstances to deter the most extreme threats against the United Kingdom and our allies. We don't regard it as a warfighting tool. The one bit of your excellent introduction, which I sort of slightly disagreed with the term that we were opening the aperture. I don't think we're opening the aperture at all. Our nuclear deterrent is there to do exactly what it was there to do before. But in order for it to remain credible, we've had to take the decisions we've taken. We continue to only have one delivery system, our SSBNs operating continuous at sea deterrent. And as Samantha will explain, we are completely acting in conformity with our obligations, not just legal, but kind of moral and political to the NPT. So if you look at the three changes that we made, the first, as you said, was the decision to change the ceiling on our stockpile from 225 to 260 weapons. And bear in mind, that's a ceiling. It's not a target. It's a policy ceiling. Secondly, we have moved away from declaring the number of missiles and weapons that are deployed on each submarine, which actually just brings us into line with French and American practice. Actually, neither of those countries have ever declared that as much at that level of detail. And thirdly, and this is, I think, your aperture point, we made a very small change to the list of technologies that might lead us to review our negative security assurances. But there's several steps in that. If an emerging technology emerged that could cause us comparable harm to a nuclear weapon, and therefore we had to deter, we could decide to review negative security assurances. But that's a very, very long way from concluding we're now planning to use nuclear weapons to deal with particular emerging technologies. What it does do is it sends a message to those countries who might be developing non-chemical and biological, non-nuclear technologies. Don't think you can do so, and the UK will sit there and say, well, obviously we couldn't deter that with a nuclear weapon. It's sending that message, if anything. But why did we take the decision on the two, I think, more significant decisions about the stockpile and the number of missiles and warheads deployed on each boat? Well, we took it because, and we've confirmed this as long ago as 2006, when we look at the minimum destructive power that we need for our deterrent to be credible, we ask ourselves, we look at our potential adversaries and we ask ourselves, what are their defensive capabilities and what are their decision-making processes likely to be? And those are the two lenses through which we, if you like, to use an American term, do the math. And that's what we did. And we've looked at the most likely potential adversaries. We've looked at their capabilities. We've looked at their decision-making processes. And we've come to the conclusion that actually we're likely to need a higher ceiling on the number of weapons we have, but higher by 15%. I mean, this is not a big increase, and as people have pointed out, it means we still remain of the P5 the country with the smallest stockpile of weapons. The decision on not being so transparent about deployable weapons is to do with complicating the decision-making process as an adversary. You don't want to make it easier for them to sit there and think, right, well, we know exactly how many weapons the UK might have at sea at the moment or might not, and therefore we can calculate what we can, what we could do and get away with, and what response they would have at each stage of a crisis. You just don't want to make that any easier for an adversary. And if you like, that's the one area where we have kind of changed policy from the past. The maths around the numbers of warheads you need are not, they're a change of how do you apply the policy in the current context, but they are still inspired by a policy of minimum credible deterrence. So I think that would be the message we want to send. Our deterrent is still minimum, but we're absolutely determined that it should also be credible. And I'm not sure how we would look our NATO allies in the face and tell them that actually we don't really, I'm not that bothered about our deterrent being credible anymore. It's got to be credible, or we shouldn't have it in the first place.
All right, thank you, Angus. So Samantha, you've got a bit of a lift here in front of you. How are you going to go about it?
So the first thing I'd like to say is that the integrated review text, for those of you who have looked at it, has more content in it on disarmament, arms control and counterproliferation than its predecessor. If you consider its predecessor to be a direct comparator, which it sort of isn't. But we very consciously took a decision that since the SDSR in 2015, we looked at the international context around counterproliferation as a sort of shorthand for all three of those things, and it's got worse. So our policy decisions, our resources, our intent through the integrated review was to make a statement that we are as committed to those issues as to what you've just heard Angus describe. And sitting as part of the British government, there is absolutely no contradiction between the two. We have right now a minimum credible deterrent. That is our posture as a nuclear weapon state. We have never seen that to be in contradiction with wanting to ultimately reach the goal of a world in which we didn't need to be. But we are not in that world. And as the integrated review sets out, we don't think we're going to be in that world, very shortly. But what we want to do is remain as committed to bringing that world about. So we are, our posture and approach to the NPT, to the Iran negotiations, to DPRK, like name your issue, none of that changed overnight with the publication of the integrated review. If anything, we've put more energy into that as a result of the world that we see ourselves in. And as an example of that, we have always chosen to be very transparent about our nuclear weapon status. We've always put out a P5, a transparency report before the NPT. People have already seen our draft for this one. That hasn't changed. And one of the things that we would like to say about this decision is that we are being transparent about this decision. If you want to know what transparency looks like, it's the hours of conversations like this one, which Angus and I and our teams have had over the last couple of weeks, and will continue to have and still have in our diaries, and we'll continue to do in the run up to the NPT review conference and afterwards. Yes, maybe it's not ideal timing with the review conference coming up. It would be an awful lot worse if the review conference was last week and then suddenly we published something. So, this is what transparency looks like. We're being very clear with people that we've taken this decision and why. And we continue to call on those who are less transparent than we are, and I've done this in person within the last 2 weeks, to join us in this level of transparency about what we have and why, and the sort of doctrine that underlies it. So we don't see any tension between the two. Of course, it becomes another thing that we wish to engage partners on. It's something that we need to talk about. We completely understand that. We're completely conscious that the review conference this year is as important as as they always are. But we would like to see an international agenda that also focuses on some of the positives in the run-up to the NPT, some of them being things like the extension of New START between the US government and Russia, others being areas of concern in the counter-proliferation pillar on Iran and on North Korea. And thirdly, the increased work that we've seen on the peaceful uses pillar, which we absolutely want to protect. And we want to have a conversation about that. We want to have an active conversation about what people gain from the NPT all around the world in countries where there are no nuclear weapons, but there are science and there is, climate benefits and health benefits and medical benefits that maybe aren't broadly understood. So I could go on a great length about our NPT kind of approach and agenda, and maybe that's for another moment. But the real message I want to land here is there's no contradiction between that and having that minimum credible deterrent and being as transparent as we are about how we handle that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, I think with that, I'm going to start weaving in some of the questions from the audience, some of which land very close to these topics. So I will, to the audience, put your questions in the chat. I'm going to try to kind of link them together the best I can. But there is a question from Aaron Mefta in the chat that I think tees up something I was going to ask you about. There's been some discussion in terms of the changing of your warhead limits and kind of some of those operational decisions having to do with more budgetary programmatic type challenges, or in particular, the extent to which it could be linked to the US program. Aaron's question says, relatedly, is what impact would it have on the UK nuclear plans in the US if the US decided to delay or perhaps scrap the W93 program? I've heard you talk about this, Angus, but why don't you go ahead and kind of take that one on?
So I think it's really important to be clear that, because some of the kind of speculation about this hasn't been really, it's really important to be clear that the US has a warhead program and we have a warhead program. Because we share the same missile and therefore use the same aeroshell that wraps around the warhead, there is a certain amount of sort of mutual support we can provide each other in taking those programs forward. But you end up with a UK warhead and an American warhead. It is important to us that the W93 program that the US Navy is pursuing moves ahead, but we have our own program, and we will take our own program forward. But the idea that somehow, I've had various speculations that we somehow got some sort of buy one get one free deal from the US on W93, and that explains why our warheads numbers are going up. It just simply isn't true. The number of warheads we need for the future is not determined by anything which the US is doing on W93.
Thanks. I'm going to stick with this for a second because we have a question also from William Albert on the stockpile ceiling question. We'll just capture several of these all together. Without really getting into operational matters, he says, isn't some of the decision on raising the ceiling related to managing risks of warhead availability and sustaining the continuous at-sea deterrent rotations? And so again, kind of this question of availability may be the same as or related to kind of your strategic question, but again, kind of that programmatic side, how much are sort of programmatics of making sure that you can actually sustain CASD part of the thinking here?
So look, I think I've set out the reasons why we did this, and they're to do with being able to assure ourselves that our deterrent is credible against the most likely situations and adversaries we might face. It is true, of course, that we face a complex program, both moving from the 4 to the 4A versions of the existing warhead, and then in the decades to come, moving to a replacement warhead. So programmatic issues are always part of the picture. But the reasons why we have raised the ceiling on our warhead stockpile are the reasons that I've given.
Going to a question, Samantha, that you sort of raised the topic, and it's also come up in the questions, is really thinking about how do we multilateralize arms control. Michelle had a question related to this in terms of calls from the deputy foreign minister in Moscow for multilateralizing formats of strategic arms control. Of course, from that perspective, the Russian calls have been for more involvement of the UK and France in kind of strategic arms control, such as sort of New START follow-ons. Of course, the United States has been pressing at various points and from various corners the involvement of China. I know that that's also been an area of controversy and challenge as we think about how to multilateralize strategic arms control. What is your thinking on that? Do you think there's a conversation to be had in that space?
I think there are several different conversations. The first thing, of course, is to be aware of is that those Russian comments from, I think it was Ryabkov originally with this time round, but they're the same conversations that have been going on for decades, and there will be participants in this conversation who remember when this was asked 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you name it. It's not new, and it is a long-standing wish from Russia really to get after NATO. So we're not going to play that game. That said, we are conscious that there needs to be a range of conversations on a range of different issues to get us to the point that I was discussing, where you can have strategic arms control that captures China as well. And we have consistently said that there needs to be a conversation which includes China. And so I think there are probably three different strands of how this can move forward. One, which you'll be aware of, is that the P5 work that we do within an NPT framework, the UK chaired that work last year, France is chairing it this year, it rotates around the P5. And that is, there are various strands to those conversations which are about building understanding and comfort, and sometimes quite a lot of discomfort, but those conversations happen between P5 nuclear experts, policy makers, and they include defense colleagues as well. So there are, some of that work will come to fruition in time for the review conference. Some of it will be, some of the value is even in having the conversation, even if you don't publicly publish an outcome. So there's been work there on the glossary, which is terms of art. Do we understand each other's terminology? There's work there on doctrines. Really, some of those conversations are quite uncomfortable, where you're sitting, in a room with those 5 colleagues. But one of the benefits of that strand is to have all 5 of us in a room starting to become comfortable to talk about the sorts of issues which are the groundwork, even if they're only baby steps, towards that strategic dialogue. So, for instance, we have seen our Chinese colleagues engage much more frankly in this process in the last couple of years. They were very proud of their chairmanship. They did, real hard work and got some progress agreed, particularly on the glossary. And we continue to see that. We also see that there's a bilateral track which each of us can be having with each of the other members of the P5, and I think that's not completely matched all the geometry, but quite a lot of that is in place to be having kind of strategic conversations about the issues that you might expect. And then, the par excellence version of that is, of course, when that comes to building on New START bilaterally between the US and Russia. And we have told the Chinese, I've done it myself, to say, we think you should also be talking to the US in this kind of way. And we would, if that comes to a point where there's a sort of P5 summit between leaders that includes some of this topic, I'm sure we would be there. But that's not the same thing as sitting down, counting dots and warheads and going, oh, well, we don't like the fact that NATO's got some, which is sort of where the Russian posture has been in the past. So when we're talking about how do we get to that ultimate goal, we need to think of all the different strands that will get us there. And I, at the moment, as of right now, I'm only talking about the nuclear part, but we also need to talk about the other elements which we've touched on in this conversation, whether that's future technology, whether it's space, whether it's whatever it might be. So there's a lot of work still to go, but I think we are committed to seeing those strands work in pragmatic terms, in realistic terms, moving the debate on in terms of rolling our sleeves up and having those conversations with each other, rather than kind of posturing and trying to call each other out to the table.
Very good. I think that does tee up a couple of interesting questions that have in the Q&A as well, about how do you think about those big strategic competitors. So the first one really has to do with the question came in: is it really wise for the UK to designate Russia as an active threat? Is this antagonistic? Is it where you run the risk of these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies by seeming to kind of tag Russia in a more adversarial light? And how do you balance that with sort of the kind of recognizing a certain reality that's underway in the security environment? I think, and then I think maybe we'll turn to China for a minute. Angus, what's your take? Russia an adversary?
So I don't think we can get away from the fact that Russia is behaving in a way where it portrays itself as an adversary to NATO. It self-defines at the moment, I think, a lot of the time, and some of its behaviour, including behaviour towards and in the United Kingdom, has just been completely unacceptable. And the Skripal affair was the sort of most salient part of that in the UK, but we've also seen cyber attacks, and as has many other countries. We're part of NATO, and NATO is a defensive alliance, and it's actually quite important, I think, that we reassure NATO allies that we recognise the direct pressure that some of them are under. And different parts of NATO feel pressures in different ways. If you're in the Mediterranean, you perhaps feel rather more the pressure of terrorism or uncontrolled migration, whatever it might be, from the south. But I think particularly if you're in Northern Europe or in Eastern Europe, a discussion about whether you feel Russia is a threat or not it's a pretty academic discussion, because actually you really feel it. So I think it's quite important that we send the message to our allies that we are aware of that we are realistic about where Russia is today. But I think that's also balanced by a willingness to engage with Russia. I mean, Samantha's just been talking about how we do that in the in the arms control and the strategic stability space. And there are other areas in which we're open to engaging Russia. But maybe it's kind of British bluntness, but if you call a spade a shovel, and I think that's what we felt we had to do in this occasion. It's partly about explaining to your own public and your own parliament why we're making investments to increase our defence budget by almost 10%. At a moment when public spending is under a huge amount of pressure as a result of the pandemic and the economic shock that has caused. You need a rationale. You need to explain to people why we're making these difficult decisions. It is primarily, as we discussed at the beginning, driven by a much more acute threat from other states.
Well,
if I might just add to that, Rebecca. I mean, it's very clear in the section on resilience in the integrated review. We talk about a whole of society approach, and some of our Northern European colleagues are ahead of the UK on this very much. We want our publics to understand the security environment which we are in. We want them to think about that, both for how they behave themselves, how they interact with media, the disinformation challenge, how they do their own cybersecurity or their own data security in a different sort of challenge. There's a need for people to understand what the scenario is. And in the UK, we've had the specifics of the sort of Russia threat on our streets. And the use of a chemical weapon in the UK, it would be slightly odd then to publish a document and pretend that hadn't happened, or somehow say that it wasn't a serious occasion. And what the consequences are of the aggregate of all of the activity that we see. So I don't think, as Angus says, it would have been entirely defensible to have a document that didn't set that out. But there is also a point here about how we build resilience.
Right. Well, it's definitely, I hear you on the resilience point and kind of the practicalities of the challenges you faced in Europe. But it's also clear in the review that you've broadened your sort of geographic landscape and have turned more significantly in your thinking to the Indo-Pacific region and considering China. There's several questions in the chat about this, both in terms of how does that actually play out? To what extent is your some of your even your nuclear decision making based on assumptions of China as a growing nuclear challenge? But I think it fits with all of the priorities that are mentioned in the review, where it is less Euro-focused than prior strategy documents from the UK. And so we'd be very interested in both of you, your thoughts on that.
I don't mind taking the China question first, although Angus will have a perspective on it, particularly what it means for defence in that geographical area. I think one of the things that's very clear in the review, we talk about systemic challenge and systemic competition. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we're talking about, frankly, different political systems. And there are regimes that are not democratic in their governance, that have a different system or a more authoritarian system of one way or another, that we see challenging the democratic system. And we believe in ours, and we want to stand up for those values. And you will see language in the document about the Force for Good agenda internationally, and standing up for democratic values is a very fundamental part of that. And the other reason we talk about systemic challenge is a challenge to the international system. And that is, we see players trying to change the rules, as we touched on earlier, to create the world that is in a different place with a different set of rules that would suit them. So for both of those reasons, we want to be engaged globally, not only nationally. Just to make the obvious point that Angus has already made it, but there is a reason that there's a lot of NATO and Euro-Atlantic security in the integrated review. That is our fundamental geographical focus for our national security. But it is also the case that the challenges that we look at, which are global, we've talked about cyber, we've talked about space, have reach, and the threats can come from anywhere in the world, not just the Euro-Atlantic area. That said, the conversation about China is complex, it is nuanced, it is always going to be the case. For instance, if you're looking for Chinese investment, Chinese even researchers in the UK, there are huge advantages to that. But they need to be in the right places and in the right ways, because if they're done in different places in different ways, then they're a national security issue. And that is something which we talk to a lot of governments who are thinking through what the consequences of that are. So you will see text that talks about China as a partner in climate change, talks about a partner in counter-piracy. There are areas where there is a huge advantage to working together. And there are others where we need to be very clear that we're in a different place. And we have that conversation with them, including about the integrated review in Beijing, which we have done and will continue to do. And it's not it's a posture of thinking about where are we as the UK and what do we care about and who are our allies and our partners, and how do we work with them on some of these systemic challenges. And as Angus touched on earlier, we know, and this is a very strong theme of the IR, we can't do any of this on our own. Having those partnerships, US primary a lot among them, but also a lot of other Indo-Pacific partners, is going to be key to what we're trying to achieve. Angus, do you want to comment on defence engagement in the Indo-Pacific area?
Yeah, sorry, I almost managed to switch myself off there, which might have been a great relief. Look, first of all, just to echo that for defence as well, I mean, this isn't a pivot away from Europe. I mean, the foundation of our global role is our role in Europe and in NATO, and that's really important. And if you look again at the pattern of investment but also the pattern of operations that we have, it's still very much anchored in the Euro-Atlantic space. You know, our core jobs as a defence power remain things like keeping the North Atlantic open, being able to bring force to bear all across the Euro-Atlantic area of operations. But as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, I mean, I think from a defence perspective, first of all, we recognise that defence is only one component of what the UK wants to do in the Indo-Pacific. So, you know, diplomacy, as Samantha has mentioned, trade policy is really important. You know, the decision to seek to become part of the CTPP, for example, is a big strategic and economic play. And there's a huge amount of climate diplomacy and human rights and other things that we would want to do in that region. From a defence-specific perspective, I think it's probably three things. Firstly, I mean, actually, we've always been in the Indo-Pacific. We've never left it. You know, we have a strategically important base in the Indian Ocean in Diego Garcia. We've had a persistent presence in Brunei, and we still have a facility in Singapore. Very close alliance with Australia and New Zealand, obviously. But we want to make that more persistent. So, you know, we will be doing, you know, some quite basic things like increasing the number of defence attaches and the staffs they have in the region, increasing the number and the consistency of ship visits, aircraft visits, etc. So we will probably, you know, have some Royal Navy assets permanently operating in the region. And then from time to time, we can do more substantive things to demonstrate our willingness to build interoperability with key allies. And you'll see that later this year with the deployment of HMS Queen Elizabeth, the first of our two aircraft carriers, which is deploying with a strike group, you know, including American and Dutch warships, which is going to go through much of that region. And will demonstrate to key allies and partners in the region there, you know, what the UK is capable of doing by way of operating with and alongside them. And then I think, lastly, there is quite a, you know, there are opportunities here in both directions for partnership. So, you know, we are building an important shipbuilding partnership with Australia because we're both building the same next generation of anti-submarine warfare frigates based on a UK design. Japan has announced that the UK will be its partner for subsystems in its next generation combat aircraft. So there are a number of increasingly important defence industrial players in the region. You know, others include India, Korea, you know, where there are relationships that are mutually beneficial to be built. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is, look, you know, it's not again, we're not alone on this. You know, France has pursued an Indo-Pacific strategy for some years now. Germany is debating one, as its defense ministry has recently, its foreign ministry, has recently published one. So, you know, I think it's a good thing that the bigger European countries, and not just the bigger ones actually, are looking to see what is the right role that we can play in the Indo-Pacific to help the US and other allies sustain stability and prosperity in that region.
Great. I'll pull in one question from the chat to encourage folks. We have a few minutes left, so if you have some questions on some topics we haven't touched on yet, please feel free to put those in. And then I have a question I want to ask as well. But one that just came in was a kind of a follow-on to this issue. Is there any plan for the UK to join the Quad due to these interests? Whether it's the Quad or other sort of structural multilateral sort of relationships there, do you see any changes or opportunities there for the UK to play a role?
I think that's probably one for Samantha to answer in the first instance. If she's still there, I can't actually see her.
I'm wondering.
I dropped out. I'm very sorry. My connection dropped me out. I'm just trying to come back in and see if it works better. There we are. So I heard about the first half of what Angus said and not the second half, I'm afraid. If you're about to ask me a follow-up question, I will try not to repeat it.
So I thought you should do it.
I think
always the way.
The question, I think, can stand alone, as Samantha. It really had to do with, in light of some of the focus, and Angus really saying, we're not new in the Indo-Pacific. We've always been there. We've had these existing sort of frameworks and relationships, whether it's across the Commonwealth or otherwise. I was just saying before we left the topic entirely, a question had come in asking about would there be any plans for the UK to join the Quad, given some of these interests. But whether it's the Quad, my question would be, to what extent structurally, multilaterally, are there ways that you might do things differently or you in the region?
Well, an example of that is we've applied for dialogue partner status with ASEAN. Mm-hmm. The Foreign Secretary was in Indonesia and Brunei only last week. So there are opportunities like that. Angus referred to CTPPP, that's another one. And we are very much thinking about how to make what we say feel and look different in those international kind of constructs as well. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Well, I wanted, before we, I know there'll be a few more questions coming in. We have a few minutes left. But one topic that came up near the beginning that we haven't had a chance, a thread we haven't had a chance to pull on, is something you both mentioned about the challenges of dealing in this highly competitive security environment when the tactics in many cases really fall below the threshold of conventional war, and that are really sort of highly competitive, but in areas where maybe we don't really understand how potentially escalatory they might be, and they might seem like a free pass to sort of compete aggressively, whether it's in disinformation, but certain aspects of cyber, even some aspects of space. How do we even communicate what the threshold is between, naughty things we don't appreciate, but which we can manage to sort of live with and ignore, right? And those things which are sub-conventional acts of aggression that may actually trigger subsequent activities or even potential conflict that may or may not have been intended. Where is that line? How do we figure out where it is, and how do we communicate it?
So I think it's a really good question, to which I don't think anybody yet has a terribly convincing answer. You'll see that in the integrated review, one of the things we commit to, it's on page 72, is a sort of national program of exercising to try and help us get our heads around how escalation might happen in a modern conflict. And in recent years, people have given quite a lot of attention, quite rightly, I think, to that threshold between kind of increasingly intense muscular competition and confrontation that doesn't cross into overt conflict and then overt conflict. So that's sort of first threshold, if you like. But I think we're also increasingly conscious that if you do cross that threshold, some of the vectors of escalation today might be very fast and might not be widely understood. For example, as you hinted at this, something might happen in space that one side thinks is a kind of inconvenience, the other side thinks is a first step towards a nuclear strike or whatever. There's some really quite complex issues there. And you've written about this, Rebecca, and I've teased you in the past about the fact that paragraph is basically the Rebecca Hersman paragraph in the integrated review, because I think it was that really good article you wrote on this about 18 months ago that got some of us thinking about this. And I think what strikes us is that, we as a country, but perhaps even more, in an even more complex way, NATO as an alliance needs to understand how it would handle decision-making in a complex crisis like that. And I think exercising both nationally and internationally is part of it. The US has for years now run some outstandingly good exercises for close allies in the nuclear space, in cyber, and in space as well, actually, the Shriva war games, for example. But actually, what's really difficult is understanding how those three things would play out together. You almost kind of want to crash those 3 war games together, and then probably get, you know, Army and Navy to join in as well with the conventional pieces. So I think there's quite a lot of hard thinking to be done here for all of us. And then if you can start to kind of work out, okay, are there some patterns we can see? Are there sort of some things that you could do to help improve lexicons and understanding and shared appreciation of what something might mean and what it might not mean, then can you use that shared understanding to help build strategic stability? I think that's the sort of second stage of it. So I think I've proved that we don't have a convincing answer to your problem, but I think we are definitely we're definitely convinced that we need to get better at answering it, not just as the UK, but as an alliance.
Yeah. No.
If I was going to add anything to that, Rebecca, if I may, I would just add more complexity, which is what do you do when there's lots of it happening at once, possibly in different theatres. And which ones do you decide are the ones that you're going to live with? What happens when it's aggregate? What if it's lots and lots and lots and lots of them? And when we talk about subthreshold, it can be a huge range of different things. It could be your sort of disavowable little green men troops, or it could be a cyber attack, or it could be an attack on our democracies and our voting systems, or it could be something happening on a space capability. And in real time, as Angus says, how do you join those dots? How do you decide even which dots are relevant to the strategic crisis type situation you'll find yourselves in and which don't? A couple of things which we've talked about in this conversation just to highlight. One is it's, as ever, really interesting to have this conversation with experts in Washington and in the UK. We need to internationalise that conversation. We're starting to do that in the Alliance, both through sort of testing these issues through Alliance exercises as well. And not everybody has got as far as articulating these questions. Not everybody has got as far as thinking, what would this add up to? When would it hit particular thresholds? What would they be ready to respond to? And the Alliance is probably further than some of our other partners in other parts of the world might be. So there's definitely an international conversation to have here. And the second is, in the meantime, there are certain things that we can do to raise the level of awareness. That might be about public debate and public conversations, as I was talking about whole of society resilience, but it's also things like Angus touched on earlier on attribution. When we see this activity and we know what it is, and we can trace it back to its source, then calling it out and calling it what it is going to be an important part of raising that international level of understanding. And when an attack has come, as cyber attacks often do, on several countries, acting jointly to say, hang on a minute, and have a sort of multilateral response or a multinational response to something is also going to be important, because often there's a tendency to try to bilateralize something and kind of freeze out a particular partner as a way of minimizing or isolating a piece of activity and then carrying on as you like elsewhere. So building international partnerships, building international understanding, and building international responses to that kind of activity is going to be a continuing part of this conversation as well. Thanks.
Rebecca, can I just come back on one thing, just on that, finish that thought? I mean, I think one of the things we might have to sort of get used to is that there are some countries in the world now fundamentally don't want us to be settled. They want a bit of instability. They quite like it, actually. They quite like keeping us off balance. And you look at the way we're all trying to understand and interpret what Russia is up to at the moment on the borders of Ukraine. Is this just an enormous exercise, or is this building to something worse? The fact that we can't answer the question is maybe part of the point, actually. And I think we're going to have to learn to live with uncertainty. It reminds me of Metternich's remark when he heard that Talleyrand had died. He said, I wonder what he meant by that. I think we're going to have to we're going to have to learn to live with an international environment where some of our counterparts are constantly and deliberately trying to keep us off balance and unsure of what's happening, why it's happening, and how we should respond.
Great. I've got 2 questions I think that'll kind of use up the last of our time coming in from the Q&A. They may be somewhat related. I'm going to kind of link them so that you can answer in series. But they really have to do with how do we think globally and geographically, right? So on the one hand, one of the questions is how do we actually better link NATO with our Asia dialogue, whether it's the Quad or otherwise, recognizing that many of the issues that we're talking about here are not respecting kind of these sort of regional orientations, whether it's matters of space, cyber, or disinformation. All of these sort of things are kind of crisscrossing all of these lines in ways that we're not used to. And how might we better structure some of our multilateral dialogues to kind of account for that? But another question came in that I realized we missed, I think is important, was more about how does the high north and the Arctic play into this? And I think, interestingly, Arctic, that's sort of an example. How geographically confined do you think about the Arctic? What is the role of China in the Arctic? And how does the high north perspective play into the review? And how has it changed? Do you see the high north challenge as sort of growing, or is something that's kind of relatively steady? So maybe with those kind of two bits of those two questions, I think that will kind of carry us to the finish line. So Angus, why don't I start with you?
So I'm the first career diplomat to have done this job in the Ministry of Defence. And when I first arrived, I found that people split into two camps. One camp said it was great, we've got somebody who understands the world doing this job. My predecessor understood the world brilliantly as well, but great, we've got a diplomat. And then the other half said, you do realize it's not about geography anymore, and geography really doesn't matter anymore, and the world is really not anything. Geography's gone, and I spent quite some time wrestling with this within the MOD. And I think the answer is that geography still really, really matters in some respects, and sometimes maneuver in the grey zone is all about maneuvering big grey things in a very traditional way around a bit of geography. So, if you, for example, if you put warships up in the high north, as we've been doing over the last 12 months, so that they can, relearn some of the skills of operating up there and remind Russia that we can operate up there, that is a very geographically specific statement to make. Equally, there are some parts of how competition is playing out today, which genuinely are much less geographically determined than they were in the past. Cyberspace, space itself, information operations. They are much less geographically constrained. I also think to go back to my earlier point about the kind of instability we face, we do face some adversaries or potential adversaries who are capable of achieving effect in many different parts of the world simultaneously. Sometimes you have to look quite closely to see if they're doing something in place A, but actually their real objective is in place B. And there's a bit of kind of deliberate a turning away of our attention. So I think geography matters, but it also doesn't. I mean, both things are simultaneously true. On the high north and the Arctic, so I think we do see this as being of increasing importance to the UK and indeed to NATO. I mean, we have a historic role in, as I mentioned earlier, control of the North Atlantic, and the high north is critical to control of the North Atlantic. We are in many ways back to worrying about the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap in a way that we did in the 1940s, and we did again all through the Cold War. So some things kind of don't change. And I think it's not necessarily just a Russia-facing issue as well. I think depending on what happens to ice patterns in the high north over the next 20, 30 years, it could also become, I mean, it's already at some times of year the shortest route between the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, by a huge margin as well. So it may not just be that Russia. So we are certainly looking as defence to maintain our ability to operate in that part of the world, deepening our links with our close allies there, in our relationship with For example, the US and Norway, when it comes to anti-submarine operations, is extremely close. The Royal Marines train in Norway, and we're also, through the Joint Expeditionary Force, developing closer relations with the Baltic countries, with Sweden, with Finland, Denmark, and the Netherlands, as a group of countries in Northern Europe who are interested in what they can do to support each other to maintain deterrence and to react to a crisis as it starts to emerge. So yeah, I think for us in defence, it's going to be an area of growing focus and importance.
Great. Well, Samantha, you're going to get the last word here.
How exciting. So I'll say, I won't repeat all of the High North stuff, except to say, if you look at your question about NATO's, does it have a role in the Asia Pacific? Does it have a role in this part of the world or that part of the world? One of the things which we want to make sure that NATO does is really think about its partnership relationships with stakeholders in all different parts of the world, where they can bring something to that NATO conversation and help NATO move forward. So, the NATO foreign ministers have met with Asia Pacific counterparts to have that conversation about what does the strategic picture look like and how can we learn from each other. And that just brings me back to this, one of the themes of the review, which is the partnership element, the integrated element, the working with others part of this. We can't do it on our own. And I can't leave the conversation, since you gave me an obvious opportunity to do so, without talking about climate change. If we look at everything that we have talked about today could be fundamentally affected by the way the planet changes in the next 20 or 30 years. And that will bring us new strategic challenges. It will bring us new relationships that we want to build up, and it will bring us new kind of scenarios and situations in which we need to think about all of the things that we've thought about so far, both including those technologies being opportunities to help with that, and if we get it wrong, and being not taking the opportunities to fix it. So the sort of the climate strand through the integrated review we haven't really talked about today, but it remains one of those kind of big policy challenge questions, which many of us are sort of hiding from because it's almost too big and scary to really break down into consequential decisions and working through what that means for the strategic picture. So maybe next time we can talk about that.
Indeed, that is certainly an entire topic for conversation, and one I hope we can get to on a future day. But for today, I really want to thank you both for coming in, having such an open conversation about the integrated review and some of the implications for strategic challenges. I know that everyone was really interested. Thanks to the audience for all of your great questions. I hope I got to as many as possible and did them justice. So we will have a virtual, it's hard to do, but virtual round of applause and expression of appreciation, but very much hope to see you both in person sooner rather than later.